Welcome back, Ultima Weapons. It's the Night Sky Prince again. Final Fantasy 15 was a game that was anticipated for ages until it released worldwide in November of 2016. Though, when it did, the story was met with some incredibly mixed receptions, oftentimes feeling like it was simply missing details, with massive amounts of plot points seemingly cut from the game, or even worse, presented off screen, only for the player to hear about it in newspaper articles or radios, rather than being able to experience it for themselves. And in the end, this made the story feel very fragmented. In a recent interview with Polygon, this is something that its director, Tabata, is looking to address with the upcoming Final Fantasy 15 Dawn of the Future, a second season of content, which he believes will help solidify the story and make it much more comprehensive to those who found it missing details at first. He starts the interview addressing his approach to fan feedback, saying, quote, "During the course of development and release of Final Fantasy 15, it's not like everything was thoroughly written in stone compared to what we're going to be doing in the future. With a lot of it, we're playing by ear, and there are a lot of things we learned from there. We also realized there's a lot of shortcomings on our side. Initially, episode Ignis was supposed to be the finale, the end of Final Fantasy 15. However, just because we planned it out that way doesn't mean that was the right way to do it." Tabata then goes on to say, "There's still this kind of connection between us and the users, so why not try and create something new based on that need? That's what we want to do with the next DLCs, create that active relationship with the users. We want to thoroughly secure the story in places where people think there are pieces of the puzzle missing. We want to alleviate those issues. At the same time, we want to build something new with the users, create a different sort of possibility with the direction that Final Fantasy 15 could head. That's something that's going to be new, and it's going to be something that's pretty exciting to make. The next DLC will be a brand new story. Last year's DLC was already initially planned from the main game. Episode Ignis, Gladiolus, and all that was Season 1. This will kind of be like moving into a Season 2. Tabata here is stating that the new DLCs come from a desire to satisfy fans who genuinely are heavily interested in the story, and have been piecing together elements of the story that weren't directly presented. Such things as Episode Arden will go a long way to addressing such issues and holes in the lore. So it is very much our demand to see the story more complete and yet also continue that has influenced Season 2. Although many Final Fantasy 15 fanboys generally agree that the story felt incomplete, even after its post-update launches, Tabata actually agrees with the majority of the Final Fantasy community's opinion, and he looks to put things right for everyone who supported the game in this next season, saying, quote, "I think you're aware of the aims of why I did it this way. We showed everything through Noctis' perspective, so that the players would become more immersed in his emotions. Things like hearing the news of the invasion via the radio, or learning of big events through the newspaper. That's the sort of thing that happens in real life, so it felt believable for the player to actually get this big news from outside sources. Those were, I think, the merits, the advantages of handling the story in this way." Now, the problem I personally have with this is that there's quite a few examples of cutscenes in the game that did not take place from Noctis' perspective, and that's absolutely fine, as oftentimes that's required to tell a good story from the character's perspective. But if that's the goal that you want to achieve, Final Fantasy VII is a much better example of telling the perspective of Cloud, the main character. Showing, not telling, is one of the first principles of good writing, so I'm surprised that he thought that violating that would actually result in a better story. Tabata then goes on to take full responsibility for the story feeling incomplete and lacking continuity. Quote, "I guess one thing that I realized after the release and listening to the feedback of everybody who's played Final Fantasy 15 was that you couldn't grasp the entire story at times. The previous Final Fantasies were much simpler, in that the player could more easily understand the entire story of each game. This was an approach that I took of my own volition. Let's try something different, and not make the story so compact and understandable. Let's keep it maybe a little mysterious in some ways. Unfortunately, that did not work to our advantage. So it's an area that we have a lot of room for growth with regarding the storytelling. It's something that we're definitely going to improve on in the future, without question." Wow, it's hard to believe that Tabata finally admitted that. After all, players would have had to watch Kingsglaive and Brotherhood before even attempting to know what was truly going on in the story. Kingsglaive, being one of the biggest pieces of that puzzle, was barely even referenced in Final Fantasy 15. It was just sort of assumed that you knew what happened in it. It was the biggest puzzle piece that was missing, and was completely absent for people who only bought the standard edition of the game, until it later appeared on Netflix, assuming you have a Netflix subscription, of course, to watch watch it. Not to mention, I also discovered that people who casually picked up Final Fantasy 15, who aren't in the Final Fantasy but simply wanted a new RPG to play, did not even know that the movie even existed. It's reassuring for Tabata to admit that there's a storytelling problem with Business Division 2, and perhaps Square Enix at large, but also seeing him accept full responsibility for 15's narrative shortcomings is actually pretty respectful of him. Tabata then goes on to talk about how not just Nomura, but many of his own ideas didn't make it into Final Fantasy 15, including a co-op multiplayer mode within the main story. Quote, "Our initial plan was to get different players to play each of the 4 buddies, then go on a road trip together," he says. "But if we had executed it with each player controlling a different character, the game would have been endless. They'd have had to work for hours and hours to get through this road trip, so we decided to stick with a single player game." Tabata then adds on to that statement by saying all our future businesses and projects are all going to be service-based. So if you enjoyed Final Fantasy 15 having a continuing stream of updates, you'll really enjoy whatever Tabata's new IP is. Though my hope is that with this next service-based game that he decides to work on, you won't have to buy critical parts of the canon story that are sold completely separate from the main game, which everything he's said thus far makes me think that that's not his intention. It was pretty big that Tabi would admit that Final Fantasy 15 storytelling was in fact incoherent and that he's fully responsible for it. Though what's done is done, and the game's story did disappoint many longtime fans, after many of which had speculated on details of the story for nearly a decade. That said, I have an open mind for how he plans to amend the game's current state with Final Fantasy 15 Dawn of the Future. So Ultima Weapons, I want to know, which episode in Season 2 are you most looking forward to? Is it episode Arden, Aranea, Lunafreya, or even perhaps episode Noctis? Subscribe, click the bell icon, and let me know in the comments below. And if you really love Final Fantasy 15, I mean really love Final Fantasy 15, be sure to head on over to our Facebook group, Ultima, Square Enix plus JRPGs, the only place in 15 universe where everything happens on screen. Link in the description below.